Clap sync, go. 1, 2, 3. Welcome to our Civil War documentary. Today we'll be covering several topics related to, you guessed it, the Civil War. So let's just jump into it. There are many forts we're going to talk about today. However, I want to start with Fort Pillow. Built in 1861, Fort Pillow was an important military installation for the Confederate Army in Tennessee. However, it only lasted until the summer of 1862 before Union forces captured it. One of the notorious events that occurred at Fort Pillow was the Fort Pillow Massacre. In April of 1864, Confederate General Nathan Forrest intended to advance on Fort Pillow and attack and capture Union prisoners. What followed was a massacre. Early into the morning of April 12th, Confederate soldiers engulfed Fort Pillow. By the afternoon, Forrest was already urging Union troops to surrender. The fort's commander had already been shot and killed, and the second-in-command, Major William Bradford, attempted to take over. Reinforcements for the Union troops were to arrive by boat. In an attempt to stall for time, Bradford called for a ceasefire lasting 1 hour, and the boats were quickly spotted and blocked by the Confederate troops when they arrived. Following this, they successfully stormed Fort Pillow without any major losses or casualties. The majority of Union soldiers were taken captive. However, approximately around 300 soldiers were gunned down by the Confederate Army. Majority of them were black. This, of course, was not the only time that soldiers were taken captive. More than 150 prison sites were used to house over 400,000 American prisoners, both Confederate and Union. Of these 400,000, 56,000 died in imprisonment. Prison sites for prisoners of war were commonly created out of old warehouses and military training facilities. The largest and most well-known prison sites are, however, as follows. The first is Camp Sumter Military Prison. Often referred to as Andersonville, this prison operated from 1864 to the end of the Civil War. Approximately 45,000 Union soldiers were imprisoned, and 13,000 of them died in captivity. It was considered the deadly landscape of the Civil War, and is the most famous of Civil War prisons. The next is Fort Alcatraz. Nicknamed the Rock, this prison consisted of Confederate sailors, sympathizers, and political prisoners. Another example is Fort Columbus and Castle Williams. Both of these prisons were located on Governor's Island in New York Harbor. In addition to being a prison, Fort Columbus also acted as a hospital for Confederate prisoners of war. It is also the place of death for the highest-ranking Confederate to die in captivity, General William Whiting. Castle Williams assisted Fort Columbus by also holding enlisted Confederate soldiers. There's also Libby Prison and Belle Isle. The majority of Union prisoners of war were held in Virginia, in tobacco warehouses. Yes, the comfiest of living places, or on Belle Isle. As for more forts, Fort McHenry is well known as the site for the writing of the song Star-Spangled Banner. As for the Civil War, though, approximately 7,000 Confederate soldiers were held here. The Battle of Gettysburg provided the fort with most of its prisoners. 33 soldiers were reported to have died at Fort McHenry. There's also Fort Wood. Constructed on Bedloe's Island in New York Harbor, it was used as a prison site as well. Most of the tenants were wounded Confederate soldiers that were going to be transferred to other prisons, but many still died in captivity, unable to recover from their wounds. Following the war, however, the fort was filled in and actually became the base of the Statue of Liberty. And last but not least, the last prison site we're going to talk about is Fort Jefferson. On a remote island west of Florida, Fort Jefferson made the ideal place for holding prisoners of war. Both Confederate and Union soldiers were held there. Union soldiers were held there, though, because of crimes not war-related. They weren't exactly prisoners of war. However, the most famous prisoner was Dr. Samuel Mudd. He was an assistant to John Wilkes Booth when he wanted to assassinate Abraham Lincoln.
If you ever get assassinated, you might need some health care. With the boom of the Red Cross, many new forms of medical miracles, though I doubt we would call them that today with the technology we have, were formed and used on the battlefield among the wounded. Some of these techniques were things like amputation, facial reconstruction, and the introduction to plastic surgery, and made embalming the dead a common practice. The main woman behind the scenes of the Red Cross was able to help spark these medical interventions into becoming more commonplace, and that woman was Clara Barton. A former teacher when the Civil War broke out, Barton was first known for delivering supplies and food to Union soldiers and was rightfully given the nickname the Angel of the Battlefield. Under Lincoln, Barton was given permission to begin the Missing Soldiers Office so that Union soldiers could have been reunited with their families and friends. All these acts of kindness and selflessness done by Barton continued as she fought to get the Geneva Convention ratified and founded the Red Cross in 1881. Barton aimed to help victims of disasters and those injured during the time of the Civil War. Her own involvement with this kindness only ended when she resigned in 1904. Many other women alongside Clara helped during the war. In fact, thousands of women during the Civil War devoted their time in hospitals as nurses to tend to the ill and the injured. Some famous nurses during the Civil War were Kate Cumming, Claire Barton, we know her from earlier, and Mary Livermore, who all spoke up about reforms in the medical department during and after the war. A lot of these reforms still have a positive impact on medical care in the U.S. to this day. It also wasn't just nurses who had their voices heard and changed the world during the war. Women like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Abby Kelly advocated and fought for the Union and the abolitionist movement. Southern women were also a part of the war. Women such as Rose Greenough operated as spies for the Confederacy, and women writers began to boom at this time, such as Mary Chesnut and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Some other women took their roles to a new level during the war, going undercover as men in order to fight, such as Albert Cashier, who was born as Jenny Hodgers, a Confederate soldier and spy. Another woman was Sarah Rosetta Wakeman, who went under the name of Private Lyons Wakeman, and her identity was not discovered during her around 2 years of service. Women who fought in the war and were discovered were taking an incredible risk, as some went without punishment, but others were faced with institutionalization or imprisonment.
Continuing our discussion on significant figures during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 in Hardin County, Kentucky. Lincoln lived a simple life. He worked on a river hauling freight and even taught himself law. However, later settling down in Illinois, his simple life began to change. He ventured into the realm of politics, becoming a member of the Whig Party. Continuing his political involvement, in 1846 Lincoln got himself a seat in the House of Representatives. Although he did not want to be reelected, he could still not escape the clutches of American politics. Lincoln joined the new Republican Party, opposers of the expansion of slavery. During his involvement, he participated in numerous debates and made several famous speeches. By this point, he had made a name for himself. His high popularity was what won him the presidency, even though he wasn't on most of the ballots in the South. Because of this, it's pretty safe to say that the Southerners weren't too fond of him being president. By the time he was inaugurated, 7 Southern states had already seceded from the Union, and the war was just beginning. During the war, Lincoln made several significant decisions. One of these was appointing the new Supreme Commander of the Union forces,
Ulysses.
Ulysses S. Grant served as one of the supreme commanders of the Union forces during the Civil War. He started as a colonel and eventually was promoted to a brigadier general by Lincoln himself. His first major victory, though, was at Fort Donelson in Tennessee. When the Confederate general asked to negotiate terms for surrender, Grant went all bamf and responded, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." After capturing Vicksburg, Mississippi, he developed a reputation and was appointed lieutenant general by Lincoln, and it was Grant who ended the fighting of the American Civil War with the final victory in Virginia. Fun fact, Grant was actually invited to the Ford Theater the night Lincoln was assassinated, but he declined to visit his family. So, dodged a bullet there, buddy.
Literally.
Following the war, Grant was recognized as a national hero and was appointed as America's first 4-star general in 1866. As for presidency, that came several years in the future. However, Grant won the 1868 election by receiving more than 52% of the popular vote and a majority in the Electoral College. As the 18th president of the U.S., Grant was the youngest president to be elected in U.S. history at the time.
While the North was equipped with their new fancy general, the South was beginning to struggle internally, specifically with their money, mainly caused by limited resources coming from the North now that the war broke out, and because of these limited resources like clothing and weapons, their price increased by about 9,000%. The North was less affected, their inflation only going up by about 80%. The North was also favored by the government, meaning they already had more funding for things like clothes, they had the ability and industrialized enough to make their own clothing, weapons, pay for their armies, etc. Along with the federal government favoring the North, there was chaos in the South due to the increase in banknotes being printed, which rose prices and eventually, because, basic economics, the dollar in the South depreciated and became practically worthless among the Southern people. Speaking of clothing, the men and women obviously dressed way different than how we do now. The women, now commonly known as Southern belles, before and during the Civil War, wore many flamboyant pieces of clothing, such as large hoop skirts, which could take up to 5 years to make. Depending on how wealthy the woman was, she could have multiple dresses for each day, such as a morning dress, an evening dress, or even a walking dress. Women within the working class had about 2 to 3 dresses per day, and women during the war had about 5 layers of clothing she needed to put on in order to be ready during the day. Common things for women to do when dressing or picking clothes was focused on nature, harmony, and simplicity. Gloves were also seen as modest, and a woman must have different pairs for different events. Hair jewelry was also an important part of a woman's dress because they were often used to remember loved ones who have died or are a long distance apart. Originally given by friends or lovers, hair jewelry soon became an indicator of mourning. Now, in terms of men fashion, of course, it was much simpler than women at the time, and not much has changed there, I guess. Anyway, since many of the men during the Civil War were, going to war, I will only be talking about the Union and Confederate uniforms of the time. Union uniforms were often made of wool and consisted of dark blues and brass buttons. They also often wore cotton shirts from home, and because they were made of cotton, they were much more scarce during the war. Contrary to popular beliefs, Union soldiers wore much more than navy blue. Men carried about 30 to 40 pounds of gear on them, which included their rifles, rations, a wool blanket, pens and ink, a shaving kit, etc. Confederate uniforms were often homemade, colored gray, brown, or khaki, which earned them the nickname butternuts. Shoes made in the South wore out quickly and were very hard to replace given most of their manufactured goods came from the North. Confederate soldiers also carried less than Union soldiers and often took their supplies from captured or killed Union soldiers. But because of this, some were killed because they were mistaken as the enemy.
Soldiers, both Confederate and Union, had a lot of time on their hands while not fighting on the battlefield. Although reading and gambling and playing tabletop games were popular among soldiers, sports were also played to pass the time. From wrestling to leapfrog, soldiers did anything they could to fend off boredom. Other sports included boxing, racing on foot or horseback, cricket, football, baseball, even bowling was played. They used cannonballs in place of bowling balls and pieces of wood in place of pins. During the Civil War, not just among soldiers, the popularity of baseball skyrocketed. Popularity boomed mostly in the northern states of New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. Soldiers played with a soft ball in a field with 2 to 4 bases, and outs were counted when the pitcher hit the runners with the ball. It was common for one regiment or brigade to challenge another to a game of baseball. Even prisoners were stated to have played baseball any time they got the chance.
Music was also an important part of specifically the soldiers' lives and pastimes. Field musicians marked the daily activities of soldiers on the battlefield from sunrise, sundown, roll call, and drills done by the soldiers. They also helped organize movement of troops, and boys as young as 12 could join as field musicians. They played things like the fife, the drums, and the bugle. Because that's totally not endangering the life of a 12-year-old who just wants to play the bugle. Marching musicians were used as regular entertainment for the soldiers rather than signifying daily events. They also did other activities like tending to the wounded and even fighting. There were fewer of these types of bands in the South than there were in the North because they were made of brass, and they often played instruments like the cornet, saxhorn, tuba, drums, and flutes or fifes. In the North, some songs they played and sang were John Brown's Body, The Battle Cry of Freedom, and We Are Coming, Father Abraham. In the South, some songs played were Dixie, Maryland, My Maryland, and The Bonnie Blue Flag. Within both armies, some songs that they shared were Lorena, The Girl I Left Behind Me, Wait for the Wagon, and Listen to the Mockingbird. Thank you for joining us for our Civil War documentary.
Don't tune in next week because our show has been canceled and it's being replaced with a showing of the hit Disney Channel original movie Civil War Buds.